My name is Akoleowo, Victoria Akoleowo, and like our chairperson has said, I'll be speaking on the topic Ethno-philosophy and alternative epistemologies in African feminist political thought, the case of Gambo Sawaba. Now, I start with a recognition of the reality of the Eurocentric hegemony in epistemic concerns. When it comes to, global epistemography, we have what we call this Eurocentric hegemony, where you have the Eurocentric epistemic monoculture that excludes alternative epistemes as invalid. And in doing so, they either commit an epistemicide against these other epistemes or they relegate them to the subaltern space as Ivac and Santos have argued over time. And so one of the resultant effects of this epistemicide is that we have what we call distortions in worldview, where these epistemes that have been relegated to the subaltern space no longer have any, they don't have space to present the knowledges that they esteem. And another effect of the epistemic hegemony of Eurocentrism is that the Eurocentric model of knowledge in current times is unable to provide accurate interpretations of the global order because, like I've just said, we have so many other epistemologies that have been either that have been relegated to the subaltern space. And so what you have is a limited dominant model. A limited dominant model of knowledge that cannot provide accurate interpretations of the global order. And as a consequence, one that offers limited normative functions. And so in recent times, the global epistemic space has been inundated with what we call the clamor for decolonization. And the clamor for decolonization simply is a repudiation of epistemicide. And this implies a detangling from colonial influences, which involves the critical undoing of colonial perspectives, which have portrayed colonizers as the dominant cultural group. And so, premised on this need for decolonization, there's a need to decolonize epistemic practices and to embrace a more pluralistic understanding of knowledge. And a foundational step in such decolonization efforts is to acknowledge that multiple ways of knowing exist and are equally valid. And this can be seen in the emergence of African and feminist philosophies. And so this work looks at how, in critiquing Western epistemic hegemony, African philosophy and African feminist philosophy have proffered alternative ways of knowing as measures to incorporate knowledges often overlooked in mainstream discussions. And I begin with a look at African philosophy and the question of ethno-philosophy. We're all familiar with the fact that African philosophy began on a note of resistance. It was a criticism, a refutation, and a repudiation of Eurocentric epistemic hegemony in the field of philosophy. And its first appearance on the academic space is usually traced to Placid Temple's Bantu philosophy. And this appearance instigated what we now refer to as the Great Debate, a debate revolving around the emergence of African philosophy that centered on whether philosophy and its methodology was universal or whether it was place specific and cultural background. And the result of this debate was particularly scam with the universities, with the universal methodology, that the methods, the concepts, and the problems of philosophy are the same any and everywhere, and that philosophy is characterized by analytic philosophizing. While you had the particularist camp who argued that philosophy is a product of culture and that authentic African philosophy can be found in the traditional belief systems or worldviews of African people. And then we had Odera Ruka, who came up with a categorization of the proposals of what had been termed African philosophy around the time of the Great Debate. And we all are familiar with the fact that Odera Oruka identified 6 trends, namely ethno-philosophy, nationalist, ideological, professional philosophy, philosophic sagacity, hermeneutics philosophy, and literary artistic. Now, amongst all these trends that Oruka identified, ethno-philosophy remains the most controversial because in its definition, it has been defined as communal or folk philosophy. It has been defined as collective, communal, cultural ideology that is derived from African cultural elements. And from these definitions, it has acquired, especially by virtue of the critiques that have been leveled against it, is that it has acquired what we refer to as a pejorative characterization. And this pejorative characterization derives mainly from, like I mentioned, the many criticisms, particularly Pauline Utonji's criticisms, where he held that the works presented as ethno-philosophy were merely unanimous presuppositions of collective views. And in that sense, they were not critical philosophies. And then he also argued that when you look at ethno-philosophy and the works presented as ethno-philosophy, they were nothing more than a form of extraversion, a mode of imperialist domination. And so following criticisms of this form, ethno-philosophy was denigrated as primitive, as uncritical, and as lacking the analytic rigor that is required for a robust tradition of African philosophy to emerge and to flourish. Now, for me, at the heart of criticisms against African philosophy is the question of what role exactly does culture play in philosophy? And from my standpoint, I look at philosophy at its most basic form as a reflection on reality. And so if philosophy is at that most basic sense, a reflection on reality, if culture is seen as a tool for conveying understandings of reality, culture in that sense is an essential source of the objects of reflection. And so culture becomes a source for this philosophical reflection. And from that premise, I argue that every philosophical tradition in that sense can be characterized as ethno-philosophical because they all deal with culture-relative questions and concepts. And so I look at the history of pre-colonial Africans. I look at the notion of alternative epistemologies in relation to ethno-philosophy and African philosophy. And I acknowledge that traditionally pre-colonial Africans relied on oral traditions for knowledge transmission because we had a historical absence of written symbols. And so knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge was through a broad range of expressions, including oral traditions, practices, and cultural artifacts. And so what you had also, because of the multiplicity of ethnic groups, languages, and traditions in Africa, what you had was the existence of a rich tapestry of thought expressed through various non-written forms. And for me, this rich tradition, this rich tapestry provides a very rich source from which philosophical insights can be gleaned. And so for me, ethno-philosophy finds its relevance as the wellspring of African philosophical thoughts. And as a philosophical approach, it emphasizes the importance of understanding knowledge within its cultural context, as well as the diversity of perspectives and experiences across different societies. And in doing so, what ethno-philosophy does is it challenges Western-centric perspectives and it offers alternative ways of understanding the world, of understanding knowledge, and of understanding human existence. And this leads us to the notion of alternative epistemologies, which are simply alternative ways of knowing. And alternative epistemologies involve rethinking knowledge systems and cultural frameworks that have been historically dominated by colonial perspectives. And so what these alternative ways of doing does is it allows for the opening of the epistemic space for other knowledges to combat and correct the global cognitive injustice that has been occasioned by Eurocentrism. In this way, it enables epistemic justice through the recognition and validation of different ways of knowing and understanding, ways of knowing that have been rooted in specific cultural, historical as subalterns. If we look at African feminist philosophy, we see that it is a field of study faced by African women philosophers. First, they're Africans who are under the yoke of Eurocentric epistemic hegemony. And second, they are women who are inferior to the male folk. And so what you have is Western feminist and African philosophies exclusion of issues arising from African women's lived experiences. You have, in that sense, a sort of epistemic marginalization. And so African feminist philosophy is a field of thought that is championed by arguments that the androcentric nature of philosophy impoverishes the discipline of philosophy itself, and more specifically, the discipline of African philosophy. Now, what we have seen in our contemporary times is that in spite of significant discourse on African feminism, this field of African feminist philosophy still remains significantly impoverished. And so in my work, I advocate that we have to consider the inclusion of alternative epistemologies for enriching the discourse on African feminist philosophy. Now, I also consider proposals that have been put forward by other philosophers. For example, you have Louis Dutoit and Coates, who talk about who make around 4 proposals on how to enrich the discourse on African feminist philosophy. And the first of the proposals they make is that there should be a philosophical interrogation of concepts, of concerns, and of critical perspectives in African feminism that is drawn from the lived experiences and from the material situations of African feminist thinkers. The second is that African feminist philosophy can be enriched with a philosophical analysis of artistic expressions by African women. The third, that there should be a dialogue between Western and African feminist philosophers and philosophy. And the last one is that is arising from other post-colonial contexts, not just African context. Now, of all these proposal, and so for me, I sources to prefer alternative ways of knowing as a response to Euro-American feminist universalism, like Grannis says. And of such sources, the cultures, the stories, the activities of African feminist figures presents as a crucial and essential aspect of such theorizing, and presents the narrative of a feminist figure, a woman, an African woman, a feminist, and a leader as political philosophy. And so I look at the woman was a Nigerian woman of Northern Nigerian extract, and she has been named in historical Nigerian female politician. She was born in 1933, February 15th to be precise, and she started a formal education which was truncated when her father and mother died in 1943 and 1946, respectively. At the age of 13 years old, she got married, And by the age of 16, she had her only child. Gambo was known from childhood for her defensive stance towards the weak. And at the age of 17, drawn from this defensive stance towards those that suffered injustice, she entered into politics. At this time, Nigeria's northern region was ruled by the conservative MPC, Northern People's Congress Party, whose leadership held that women's condition under the ultra-Islamic social-political system was satisfactory and that women were happy about their condition. Now, in opposition to this particular position, another party, the Northern Elements Progressive Union, and they joined. Now, this party that she joined espoused anti-colonialism and anti-corruption ideologies, but together with that, it also supported women's access to religious and secular education, and it advocated for women's participation in political and the economic public sectors, a position that resonated with Sawaba's sense of justice. And Sawaba joined this party, and influenced by Southern agitations for women's suffrage, she advocated for jobs for women, education for girls. She also advocated for women's suffrage. She had advocated labor, which were issues of her time. Now, the very first result of her political activism was the breakdown of her marriage, followed by her, we really don't have time, I would have described of her time. Now, she's recorded to have been arrested and jailed 16 times in total. Eventually, her activisms in the ultra-conservative Muslim Nigerian North resulted in her banishment from Kano and her subsequent relocation to Zaria, her hometown, where she continued her advocacies. Now, from her history and her activisms, have been able to extract a few philosophies. And I start with her philosophy of activism. For me, activism is deeply rooted in cultural context, and here it is characterized by the use of local traditions and values to mobilize and advocate for change. More importantly, activisms are premised on resistance to oppression and issues on freedom and justice, issues that are well articulated in various forms of philosophizing. Now, Sawaba's activisms fall under such efforts towards freedom and justice. Her activisms were particularly influenced by the theories of philosophers like Karl Marx and political figures like Thomas Sankara, whose pictures held prominent spaces in our homes. Her activisms were characterized by civil disobedience, and she not only accepted the jail terms for her advocacies for girl child education and women's voting rights, she was prepared to pay the price for imprisonment and assault, to the extent that she kept a blanket with her at all times that she named prison yard. In case of arrest, she was ready to be arrested at any time. Her activisms were also characterized by an emphasis on equality and human rights. And much of our activisms were on the basis of the fact that women also should be accorded equal rights and should be free from tyranny and dictatorial leadership in governance. And it was on the basis of these activisms that she gained the name Sawaba. She was born Hajarat Gambo, but she was named Sawaba for her activisms. The name Sawaba means freedom or redemption. And with time, that name in northern Nigeria became synonymous with the politics of freedom and emancipation for women. She also espoused the philosophy of solidarity. She worked assiduously with nationalists of like minds towards resisting oppressive policies, especially those policies in relation to women, as seen from her speaking at rallies organized by nationalists. you can also find a philosophy of resistance within her activisms. And we must remind ourselves that when we look at feminist and African philosophies, at their very roots, they're foundationally premised on resistance to oppression. And so, in this instance, for Sawaba, the oppressive conditions inherent in patriarchal societies, especially the conservative Muslim north of our time, constituted limitations to women's agency, which was why she advocated for suffrage for women and for equality on that note. And having looked at this, I now look at the implications of Gambo's life and activism for African women. And I argue that my paper moves away from African philosophy, of African feminist philosophy being a reactionary discipline, and moves to tell a story of Africans, which is very important to the discipline of Africa. It exposes the history of an African figure, and it exposes that history as one that is based on a tradition of activism and solidarity. It discusses the resistance to oppression and the issues of freedom and justice as it pertains to the existence of personal and social identities in Africa, as well as explores the need for African philosophy to be a transdisciplinary discipline. As Adesina Afolayan opines, it is significant to expand the African philosophical discourse to create the possibility for a transdisciplinary space which allows for a multifaceted confrontation of the African predicaments around the discipline of African philosophy. What are the implications of Gambo's activisms for African feminist philosophy? The very first of the implications is the correcting of foreign imports. That's the first one. To continue deconstructing Eurocentric frameworks and to embrace alternative epistemologies that center Africans' experience and perspectives. And so in doing this, it extends oppression and unjust social policies in Nigeria. And so in this effort, it is an addition to the efforts of feminist scholars who have worked and who are still working to open up spaces to reimagining African cultures and futures beyond the colonial and neo-colonial paradigms by opening up a counter discourse of resistance and revealing contradictory identities towards regaining of the discourse, regaining control of the discourse on self-identity. And so I conclude that my paper has presented an attempt at telling an African story from the standpoint of an African culture. And in doing so, it has attempted to move away from defending African philosophy to actually start engaging in the task of doing African philosophy. Premise on an ethno-philosophical approach that interrogates culture to retrieve issues that can be learned and engaged, it has presented Sawaba's activisms as a reminder of the power of grassroots activism and community organizing in driving social change, empowering marginalized communities, and as a mode of dismantling Eurocentric hegemonies by using methods and alternative epistemologies that center African experiences and perspectives. Thank you for listening.